The stars blinked like cold, indifferent eyes as the Vindication drifted through the void, its sleek, black hull cutting through the emptiness with a quiet fury. In the command center, the hum of the ship's systems was the only sound. Calm before a storm. Commander Aaron Drake stood at the helm, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the projection of the Xy'rth fleet. The invasion was already underway, their massive warships blotting out the light. The enemy armada was vast, too vast. He could feel the weight of the universe pressing in, 1,000 years of evolution and conquest staring down humanity's last line of defense. Every minute that passed was another one where the Xy'rth laughed at the idea of a single human warship threatening their might. They'd made that clear from the beginning. Humanity wasn't even a blip in there. A mere nuisance, something to be crushed with a wave of their tentacled hands. Captain, we're getting reports from the colonies. It's worse than we thought, said Lieutenant Jensen, her voice taut, thin as the thread they were hanging on. She turned away from her terminal, eyes wide with disbelief. Earth's fleet is gone. Every last ship. We're all that's left. Drake's jaw tightened. No surprise there. Earth's fleet had always been a fraction of the enemy's power. But this was different. The Vindication wasn't supposed to be the last hope. It was supposed to be their first strike, their redemption. But it was just him now, and the Vindication. The rest of the fleet had already fallen. He turned to the crew, every face in the room marked by exhaustion, fear, and "We may be the underdogs," he said, his voice low but steady. "But we'll fight like hell, because they think we're weak, and we've got nothing to lose." The silence was sharp, the kind that cuts through everything. It wasn't hope, it was defiance, and that would have to be enough. The orders came through with a crisp, mechanical buzz. Drake's fingers hovered over the terminal, the cold touch of the screen a harsh reminder that everything hinged on this one mission. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, the weight of their expectations, pressing in from all sides. They'd known the risks everyone did, but this was it. The last chance. Humanity's last shot. He read the message twice, but the words didn't change. Intercept the Xy'rth mothership. Destroy their flagship. Any means necessary. No reinforcements. No backup. It was just him, the Vindication, and a few hundred souls who had no business surviving a fight like this. "Captain," Lieutenant Jensen spoke, breaking the tension with a voice that shook, despite her attempt to keep it steady. "You've seen the reports. We're outgunned, outmanned. This is suicide." Drake glanced at her, then at the rest of the crew. There were no lies in her words. Every data point confirmed it. The odds were impossible. But what else could they do? The Vindication had been built for a moment like this. And he was born to face it. Then let's make sure they know they made a mistake underestimating us. The silence that followed was a quiet roar. The ship's engines rumbled to life. They were heading straight into hell. The vast expanse of space stretched before them, an endless sea of black, dotted with pinpricks of light. But the Vindication didn't feel like it was moving through nothing. The ship felt like it was sinking into something, the tension in the air growing thicker by the second. Drake stood at the helm, hands gripping the cold steel of the command chair, eyes scanning the tactical readouts flickering across the screens. The Vindication was built to handle this. But there was a chill in his gut that wouldn't go away. "Status report," he said, his voice low, the words almost lost in the hum of the. Lieutenant Jensen didn't hesitate. "Shields are holding, Captain. Weapon systems are online, but we've got only a fraction of the power we need to make a real dent in their fleet. If we go on like this, we're not coming out." Drake nodded. She was right, but this wasn't a normal fight. This wasn't a normal war. They weren't here to win. They were here to make a statement. He glanced at the crew, young faces hardened by desperation. They'd never seen combat like this. No one had. The Xy'rth had wiped out entire fleets without breaking a sweat. But this was the moment. "We don't fight like they do," Drake said, his voice slicing through the. "We fight smarter. We fight with everything we've got left. We make them regret thinking we were weak." There was no response. But the crew didn't need to speak. Their eyes said it all. The ship entered the Xy'rth controlled zone with a low, thunderous roar, engines pushing forward like a beast ready to tear into the darkness. The fight had begun. The first wave of enemy ships came out of the blackness like ghosts, massive alien shapes that flickered into view with a chilling silence. No fanfare, no warning, just the deadly presence of something far beyond humanity's reach. The Xy'rth had arrived. Drake's breath caught in his throat as he studied the incoming fleet, his mind working at full speed, calculating trajectories, possible outcomes, the odds of. He didn't like what the numbers told him, but he wasn't in the business of playing it safe anymore. "Captain, the enemy has us on their sensors," Jensen said, her fingers dancing. "They're targeting our weapon systems." "Ready weapons," Drake snapped, cutting her off. He had no time for hesitation, no time for fear. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. All hands to battle stations." The ship trembled as the Vindication leapt to action, shuddering under the sudden surge of power. Drake's pulse was steady, faster, yes, but steady. This was what he trained for. This was what they all had trained for. The sound of his heartbeat in his ears was drowned out by the explosion of. The first Xy'rth ship was massive, a leviathan of chitinous plating, and its weapons flared to life, releasing a barrage of plasma bolts that tore through the emptiness toward them. The Vindication swerved hard to starboard, dodging the incoming fire, sending the ship into a dizzying roll that made every crew member brace for impact. "Shields holding at 30%, Jensen yelled, her voice strained. "We're not gonna last long like this." But Drake didn't flinch. "Give me more power to the forward cannons. We're not running, we're fighting." The Vindication powered through, guns firing, the sound of impacts shaking the first Xy'rth ship exploded in a bright flash of blue and white, a brief but beautiful eruption of triumph. But there were more, and the battle was only just beginning. The chaos of the battle had turned into a blur of flashing lights, twisting metal, and the deafening thrum of weapons fire. The Vindication was alive with noise, its crew scrambling from station to station, fighting just to keep the ship intact. But underneath the urgency of the moment, something else was brewing, a dark undercurrent of doubt that had begun to surface among the crew. Drake could feel it in the air. The tension wasn't just in the battle. It was in the faces of his crew, in the way they moved a little slower, hesitated a little longer. It had been hours since the first wave of Xy'rth ships had been obliterated, and the victory felt hollow. The enemy had taken a hit, sure, but they were still there, and they were coming back. Drake stood in the middle of the bridge, watching the crew work. His eyes flicked from one monitor to another, his mind calculating, processing. But even he couldn't deny the truth: they were losing ground. The Vindication was taking damage. The energy reserves were draining. The shields wouldn't hold much longer. "Captain," said Jensen, her voice edged with something tight and brittle. "We're running low on ammunition, and the Xy'rth are consolidating. We need to make a call, now." Drake didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the tactical map. The alien fleet was reforming, now shifting into a defensive position, like a predator circling its prey. There was no escaping them. The decision was clear. Prepare the quantum disruptor. We're going after their command ship. "Sir," Jensen's voice cracked with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "If we launch that, we're draining the last of our power. We won't have enough to survive the next wave." A silence followed. The whole crew knew it. The quantum disruptor was their last card, and playing it meant gambling with. "I'm aware," Drake replied, his voice cold but steady. He locked eyes with Jensen, and for a moment, the weight of everything between them hung heavy in the air. "But we're not dying here without making them bleed first." He turned toward the operations console, locking in the command. The tension in the room thickened, the realization hitting everyone that they were past the point of no return. As the orders went out, A soft murmur spread across the bridge. Some of the crew exchanged glances, some with hope, others with fear, but no one. This was it. The countdown to death had begun. The low hum of the ship's engines felt oddly soothing as the crew went to work, preparing for what could be their final mission. Drake stood alone in the command center, his eyes locked on the glowing screens, every light flickering with the pulse of a dying heartbeat. The Vindication was taking a beating. The shields were at 15%, the hull scorched, and the crew was worn down to the edge of exhaustion. But there was something in the air now, something different. A sharpness, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. "Captain," Jensen's voice broke through his thoughts. "We've found something. A weapon, something hidden in the lower cargo bays. It's not on any of the schematics." Drake turned sharply, meeting her gaze. "What are you talking about?" She gestured toward the console beside her. The image on the screen flickered into view. A massive cannon, dark and sleek. Its form alien in design. It looked like a beast, something not made by human hands, not part of any known. "That thing was hidden in the deepest recesses of the ship's hold," Jensen said, her voice steady but unsure. "We've only just unlocked its schematics, and I'm not sure we'll have the power to use it." Drake moved toward the screen, eyes narrowing. The weapon was formidable, that much was clear. But it wasn't just the weapon that caught his attention, it was the look on. She wasn't scared. She was nervous. A different kind of fear. The kind that came from the unknown. "How long to get it online?" "At least an hour," she replied, fingers already moving over the console, her eyes darting back and forth. "And that's if we can reroute all the remaining power from the auxiliary. It's going to drain the ship dry." An hour. They had maybe 20 minutes before the Xy'rth launched their next assault. But he could see the desperation in her eyes. The crew was already stretched thin. They couldn't afford to wait. "We don't have an hour," Drake said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding in his mind. "We need to use it now." The room went still for a moment. The hum of the ship felt louder, as if it could sense the weight of the. Jensen hesitated, then nodded, grimly. "Understood, Captain. Get it online. Now." As she rushed to reroute the ship's energy, Drake felt a strange chill crawl up. They had no idea what this weapon would do, but the Xy'rth didn't leave much room for doubt anymore. It was all or nothing. And this was their last card. The ship shuddered beneath him, an unrelenting vibration that had become the soundtrack of desperation. The quantum disruptor was powering up, but the low hum of its charge felt to quiet. Drake gripped the edge of his command chair as the tension coiled tighter in his. The Xy'rth Armada was moving into position, their warships forming a formation that blocked out the stars. They were preparing to strike in full force, a tidal wave of destruction too, massive for anything humanity had ever faced. "Captain," Jensen's voice was strained, but focused. "The disruptor's at 30%. We'll need more time to charge it fully. But I'm pushing everything I can to get." He stared at the image of the Xy'rth mothership, a massive, chitinous leviathan of black and green, its form bristling with energy spikes that pulsed like a. That heart was about to crush them, and if they didn't strike now, they wouldn't. "Make it work, Jensen," Drake growled, turning back to face her. "We don't have time for perfection. Get it to 60%. And fire." A shudder passed through the crew, not just from the ship, but from something deeper, something primal. This wasn't just about survival. This was about revenge, about showing the Xy'rth they couldn't just walk over humanity like an afterthought. Jensen didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the console, the glow of her screen lighting up her face. The hum of the disruptor grew louder, a steady crescendo that filled the room. The crew was silent now, all eyes locked on the flickering holographic map. The Xy'rth ships were closing in, each one bristling with weapons, their firepower unimaginable. The seconds stretched. 60%, Captain, Jensen announced. There was no pride in her voice, only the thin edge of panic that had begun to fray the edges of her control. We're pushing everything into this. If it doesn't work, we're done. Drake took a breath, his gaze unwavering. His entire body was an aching knot of tension. We don't need it to be perfect. We need to hit them now. He turned to the gunner, his voice sharp. Fire. The Vindication groaned as the weapon fired, the cannon's blue-white blast, screaming through the black void like the wrath of God. It tore through space, a wave of pure energy that streaked toward the mothership, with the fury of 1,000 storms. And then, for one heart-stopping moment, there was silence. No sound, no explosion, just the cold, unfeeling eyes of the enemy staring back. The flash of the quantum disruptor burned across the blackness, a blinding burst of light that consumed everything in its path. For a split second, time itself seemed to freeze, the universe holding its. Then, the shockwave hit. The Vindication rocked violently, its hull groaning under the pressure of the. A deafening roar filled the ship's corridors, and the lights flickered wildly as the ship struggled to maintain its systems. Status, Drake barked, his voice steady but taut with anticipation. Shields are down to 10%, Jensen's voice cracked over the comms. Engines are destabilizing. We've taken massive hull damage on Deck 3. The disruptor's energy reserves are at critical levels. Before she could finish, the bridge's screen flared to life with a new image. It wasn't the quiet emptiness of space. It was the aftermath of their shot. The Xy'rth mothership, their mothership, was still there, but something had. The massive warship, once so proud, was torn open along its side, its armor peeled back like the layers of a rotting fruit. Its energy core flickered dangerously, sending out violent pulses of light, lit up the space around it. The attack had done damage, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Captain, the tactical officer said, his voice trembling. The mothership's destabilizing. It's still alive, but it's not moving. They're in disarray. Drake didn't wait for him to finish. His hand slammed down on the intercom, his eyes never leaving the screen. All hands, prepare for another attack. We're not done here. He turned to Jensen, who was already working feverishly at her console. The tension in her body was evident, her face pale under the pressure. She was giving everything she had, and it wasn't enough. They just crippled the Xy'rth flagship, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. We're running out of time, she said quietly, her hands hovering over the controls, the desperation bleeding through her calm demeanor. If we don't finish this now, the mothership's going to regenerate. The core is still active. The bridge was silent for a beat. Then, Drake exhaled, slow and deliberate, the weight of their situation settling. You heard her, he said, turning toward the rest of the crew. This is it. We finish this now. We either kill them or we die trying. His gaze swept over them, every face drawn, every eye focused. They were all broken, worn, battered, but alive. And that, at least, was something the Xy'rth hadn't accounted for. The final shot would be theirs, and it would be their last. Jensen, he said, voice low, but steel beneath it. Load the disruptor again. We're not done yet. The Vindication trembled under the strain, its systems faltering as the crew worked in frantic unison. The bridge felt like a pressure cooker, every breath thick with the weight of. The blast from the quantum disruptor had done damage, but it hadn't destroyed the Xy'rth mothership. The beast was still alive, still breathing just barely. And in that brief window of hope, Drake knew there was no turning back. The tactical map on the screen flickered as the Vindication drifted, its engines failing under the strain of its damaged systems. Outside, the Xy'rth fleet was like a pack of predators circling a wounded animal, waiting for it to make the first move, so they could finish the job. But humanity wasn't going to go down like that. Not without a fight. Captain, Jensen's voice came through, tight but steady. We've got one shot left. The disruptor's charging again, but it's going to take every ounce of power. If we miss this time, we'll have no way of surviving the next attack. Drake turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers, as if willing his strength into. She was right. This was it. One shot. One final chance to end it all. He moved to the center of the bridge, his feet feeling heavier with each step. The crew was exhausted, drained. They'd been in this fight for hours, maybe longer, and every man and woman aboard the Vindication had pushed themselves to the brink. But now, in the quietest moments before chaos erupted again, Drake knew one thing for certain: they were ready. Every one of them was ready to make that final stand. All hands, Drake spoke into the ship's comm, his voice low, but carrying the "We're going to make sure the Xy'rth never forget who we are. Get to your stations. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for everything we've ever built. For Earth. For our future." A surge of energy rippled through the bridge as the crew took their places. Jensen's hands flew over her console, and the hum of the disruptor, now fully powered, filled the room like the ominous drone of a coming storm. Every face in the room was set, eyes steely with resolve. There was no fear now, only the cold certainty of what had to be done. "Target lock," the tactical officer's voice came through, sharp and clear. "We've got a clear shot at the mothership's core, Captain." Drake turned to face the screen. The Xy'rth flagship loomed large in the distance, barely hanging on to life. Its massive, armored form was a grotesque mockery of a ship, its once pristine surface now marred by the gaping wound from the first shot. But the core was still glowing, a pulsing light at the heart of the monstrosity. One clean shot. That's all they had. "Jensen," Drake said, his voice steady, colder now, like the calm before the "When you fire, make it count. Do not miss." She nodded once, a flicker of determination crossing her face. "Firing in 3, 2. The ship lurched violently as the disruptor fired, the pulse of energy roaring to life, streaking through space like a harbinger of doom. Time seemed to stretch in those precious seconds, the whole universe holding its. The Vindication shuddered again, as if the weapon itself was pulling the ship apart, but Drake didn't flinch. He stared, eyes locked on the screen, as the beam of light cut through the void. It hit. The core of the Xy'rth mothership erupted in a burst of white-hot energy, a shockwave of force that rocked the ship to its very core. The mothership didn't just explode, it disintegrated. The blast consumed it whole, tearing through its massive frame like paper. The energy pulse swept through space, a tidal wave of destruction that sent debris and wreckage scattering into the dark void. "Direct hit," Jensen shouted, her voice tinged with disbelief. But there was no triumph in her tone, only the grim satisfaction of a job done. "The mothership's gone. It says over." Drake didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't feel victory. All he could hear was the ringing silence that followed the explosion, the absence of the enemy, the fading sound of the Vindication's engine straining to. Outside, the remnants of the Xy'rth Armada were in disarray, their flagship destroyed, their will to fight shattered. Some ships were fleeing, others floating aimlessly in the void, their lights. It was over, but the price had been steep. Drake turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over the bridge. "We did it, but we're not done yet. Get ready. There's still a war to finish." He didn't know how they'd survive the next phase of the battle. He didn't know what came after this. But for the first time since the Xy'rth invaded, he felt something close to hope. Humanity wasn't finished. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was about to learn the true cost of underestimating the human spirit. The Vindication was still alive, and so were they. And as long as they drew breath, they would keep fighting. The silence was the worst part. After the eruption of the mothership, after the fiery collapse of everything that had once stood as a symbol of Xy'rth's superiority, there was nothing. No cheers. No victory cries. Just the low hum of the ship's broken systems, the constant drip of failing pipes, and the soft, steady breathing of the crew as they tried to process what. Drake stood at the edge of the command center, eyes scanning the dark expanse of. The Xy'rth fleet was in ruins. The flagship was gone. The survivors, what few there were drifting in chaos, their once perfect formation shattered. But something gnawed at him. There was no satisfaction in their destruction. Only the grim, gnawing weight of what they'd had to sacrifice to get here. Captain, Jensen's voice cut through his thoughts, though she hesitated before. She always hesitated after a battle. Always. I'm running diagnostics. We've got a hull breach on Deck 6, and life support's compromised in the aft section. We're losing oxygen fast. Drake didn't respond at first. He was too focused on the view, on the wreckage of the Xy'rth ships scattered. The victory was theirs, but it felt hollow empty, even. They had killed the beast. But now what? What did it all mean? They hadn't just fought for survival. They had fought for something bigger, something they had yet to truly grasp. We can't keep this up, Captain, Jensen said, her voice cracking as she continued to scan her console. We've lost power to half the ship. The systems are failing faster than we can fix them. Drake finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. The strain on her face was visible, but it was more than exhaustion. There was something else behind her eyes now, something that mirrored what he felt, a sense of foreboding that hadn't been there before. The Xy'rth were just the first wave, Drake muttered, his voice low and filled with a strange mix of certainty and dread. There are more, and they'll be back. Jensen nodded slowly, her face paling as the realization settled between them. You think this was just a test? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Drake didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the view, his gaze hardening. This was only the beginning. We've got to prepare for what's coming next. The crew was already preparing, moving through the ship's darkened corridors, sealing off breaches, rerouting power, and trying to keep the Vindication alive. Long enough to fight whatever came next. The war was far from over. The Vindication was a dying ship, and everyone aboard knew it. The battle had taken its toll, and the aftermath wasn't just the physical wounds of battle, it was the slow, grinding realization that they weren't out of danger. The crew worked in a feverish haze, patching up holes and rerouting power as fast as they could. But the ship wasn't built for this. It wasn't built for a war with a superior force. Drake walked the hallways in silence, his boots clanging against the metal floors, the lights flickering in time with his steps. The crew had scattered to their posts, doing what they could to keep the ship functioning, but the atmosphere was thick with something unspoken, something heavier than just fatigue. Fear, maybe. Or maybe the feeling that they were no longer fighting for survival but for. A wave of static crackled over the intercom, cutting through the quiet tension. Jensen's voice, strained and urgent, filled the ship. Captain, we've got a breach in the lower hangar bay. It's an enemy boarding craft. We've got no shields. I repeat, no shields. Drake's jaw tightened as he stopped in his tracks, the weight of the words settling in like a punch to the gut. They couldn't afford another breach. They couldn't afford to fight anyone on their own ship, not with their resources. Stretch this thin. Send a full response team, he ordered, his voice cold with command. Seal the hangar doors. Now. There was a pause before Jensen responded. The doors are sealed, but it won't hold them for long. The hull's already compromised. They're using some kind of advanced plasma cutters. This isn't just a boarding. It's a full assault. Drake didn't have to think twice. He knew what needed to be done. The Vindication was all they had left. They couldn't afford to lose it. All hands, prepare for combat. Drake's voice rang through the intercom. A steady command that echoed through every corridor. We've taken their best shot. Now it's our turn. He turned, his mind already calculating the next move. His hand tightened on the grip of his sidearm as he moved quickly toward them. The corridors were eerily quiet, but the stillness only made the tension heavier, like the air itself was waiting for the next explosion. The ship had taken its beating. The crew had to. But humanity wasn't done yet. Jensen, what's our enemy's strength? Drake asked, voice low, almost mechanical. They're coming in hot, sir, Jensen replied. Close to 50 troops, and they've got advanced weaponry. It's not just a boarding party they want this ship. Then let's make sure they never get it. Drake's grip on the gun tightened as he prepared to face the new threat. The Vindication had survived the first wave. Now it was time to survive the next. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burned metal and the hiss of depressurizing vents. Drake's boots slapped against the cold, grated floors as he sprinted down the corridor, the sound of his breath sharp in the silence. Every step was a countdown. Every second that ticked by meant more distance between him and the hangar, more chances for the enemy to breach the Vindication's heart. He reached the lift and slammed his palm on the panel. The doors hissed open with a mechanical groan, and he stepped inside, his mind focused on the battle ahead. He could hear the muffled thumps of plasma shots in the distance close enough to rattle the walls, but too far to see. "Jensen," he said, his voice tight as the lift started its descent. "Give me the status on the lower levels." "Where are they coming from?" "Portside hangar," she replied, her voice sharp through the comms. "They're pushing toward the control rooms. We've got casualties on deck 4. The enemy's got full gear energy shields, plasma rifles, and something else. They've breached the reactor corridor. We can't afford to lose that, Captain." Drake clenched his jaw. If the reactor went, the Vindication would be nothing more than a floating tomb. Its crew vaporized in an instant. He couldn't let that happen. "Secure the reactor corridor at all costs," he commanded. "We can't give them access to the core." The lift came to a screeching halt, the doors opening to the sight of chaos. The hallways were in shambles, doors blown open, debris scattered across the crew had been scrambling to respawn, but they were outmatched. Xy'rth commandos, almost indistinguishable from the shadows they moved, slithered through the corridors with a terrifying precision. A quick burst of gunfire erupted from down the hall, the sharp crack of plasma raking through the air. The enemy had found their first target, 2 soldiers already pinned behind her. They fired back, but it was hopeless. The Xy'rth soldiers were too fast, too efficient. Drake could hear them getting closer, the skittering sound of boots moving rapidly across the metal floor. "All units, fall back to the defensive positions," he shouted over the comms. But there was no mistaking it now. They weren't just defending, they were being hunted. Drake moved into the fray, his own gun raised as his pulse quickened. There was no room for hesitation now. They were fighting for the Vindication's survival. The ship was theirs, and the Xy'rth would learn humanity didn't give up without. "Let's make them bleed," Drake muttered under his breath, pushing forward into. The first shot came before he could even register it, burning through the air. Then another, a hit on his shoulder. But it didn't stop him. Nothing would. He fired back, a roar of gunfire echoing in the corridor as the siege on the Vindication began in earnest. The battle raged in the dimly lit corridors of the Vindication, the constant crackle of plasma fire and the rhythmic thud of boots pounding against metal, echoing like a war drum. Drake moved through the smoke-filled hallways with a predator's focus, his gun gripped tightly in his hand, his mind sharpened to a razor's edge. He could hear the shouts of his crew, the harsh commands, and the frantic orders, as they fell back into their defensive positions. But there was no time to. Every inch of the ship was now a battleground. "Push them back," Drake yelled, voice hoarse as he ducked behind a jag piece of debris, narrowly missing the deadly arc of plasma that sliced through the air. The heat from it was like a wave, searing his skin even through the armor. But there was no time to think about the burn. He had to move. A figure darted past him, a shadow in the smoke. One of his crew, bleeding from a wound on her arm, her face set in a grimace of pain, but still fighting. Drake shot a glance at her, meeting her eyes for a split second. It was all the confirmation he needed. They would not break. Drake pressed forward, moving cautiously but quickly, his boots making no noise. On the grated floor, the Xy'rth were everywhere, their sleek, black armor blending seamlessly with. He could hear their low, guttural growls, their communication in clicks and hisses as they moved in perfect synchrony. Their battle tactics were brutal, precise, calculated, but they underestimated one thing they hadn't accounted for: humanity's will. The corridors were alive with violence. As Drake turned a corner, he spotted the Xy'rth soldiers, their backs turned, focused on a small group of his crew pinned behind a barricade. Without hesitation, he dropped to one knee, leveled his gun, and squeezed them. The first shot hit clean, the second one just as fast. Both Xy'rth soldiers crumpled to the floor before they even had time to react. Drake didn't wait to watch them fall. He was already on his feet, charging forward, cutting down another Xy'rth soldier who had emerged from a side hallway. The plasma shot burned through the air, but he was already moving, his own weapon spitting death. His team was fighting like demons, pushing the Xy'rth back inch by inch. They were running out of time, though. The pressure was mounting, and the ship was slowly dying under the weight of the captain. Jensen's voice crackled through his earpiece, strained but steady. We've got another wave coming through Deck 7. We can't hold them off much longer. We need help in the reactor corridor now. Drake's teeth clenched as the words hit him like a physical blow. The reactor was everything. Lose it, and they were dead. But if he pulled more forces away from the main hull, they'd lose the front. There was no easy choice. Roger that. We're on our way, Drake replied, voice clipped. He turned back to his team, barking orders as they moved in sync, falling into. They were a well-oiled machine now, no longer just survivors. They were soldiers. The Vindication was their home, and the Xy'rth had no right to take it from. Stay sharp, Drake ordered as they moved toward Deck 7, every step a calculated. We fight through this or we die trying. No one gets left behind. We make them bleed. Another burst of gunfire. Another enemy down. But with each kill, there were more waiting in the shadows. The Xy'rth were relentless, and so were they. As they reached the reactor corridor, the stench of burning metal hit him first. Then came the blast and explosion that rocked the Vindication to its core, throwing Drake off balance. He barely caught himself, his hand braced against the wall, heart pounding in. Damn it, he hissed under his breath. He reached for his communicator. Jensen, what the hell was that? There was a pause, and then her voice returned, tinged with panic. They've breached the reactor. It's gone critical, Captain. We've got maybe 30 minutes before the whole ship goes up. Drake's blood ran cold. 30 minutes. 30 minutes to save everything they'd fought for. Get to the core, he commanded. Seal it. If we don't, I know, Captain, Jensen cut in. We're on it. Drake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The clock was ticking. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The Xy'rth might be the ones at their throat, but if they didn't stop this reactor from going critical, the war would be over before humanity had a chance. His grip tightened on his gun. Let's finish this, he muttered under his breath. And they did.